I want to touch on one thing you said about what I call the grey time. This is a kind of an invention of mine, but it goes back to the time of Treaty of Westphalia, the 17th, 18th centuries, when you can see in history, at least in European history, Europe was made up of peoples and dukedoms and realms and anything but a nation state. So it was just all like tribes moving around, and a lot of the borders were very fluid. And if you look at the history of Joan of Arc in the 15th century, if you look at the maps of France, so-called France, gradually England, which was half of France, was pushed out because of Joan of Arc. And so a lot of these borders were very fluid until you get to the nation state. And then they start to seek kind of permanence or definition, which in itself brings problems. But it's kind of like saying, okay, we're French, so French is here and English is over there. We're not going to muddle up anymore, in a way so that we can all have our own identity, in order, I would say, to have a conversation, not in order to say you're all going to speak French or no, you're all going to speak English. So there is this kind of story always in the background. And the corresponding side of that is economic life is always seeking to be of a one world nature. There is no such thing as a national economy. This is just crazy. I live right beside Dover in England, and almost out of my window, I can see the highway that goes to Dover. And because of Brexit, there are so many problems. That highway is what you don't see. You see trucks, endless trucks going up and down it until a boat stops leaving the harbor, or until someone's got their papers in the wrong, or until some little thing happens in Dover harbor or across the way in Calais. And then that highway becomes a car park or a lorry park, maybe for 30 miles. It's literally used as a lorry park because you can't stop this constant flow of material back and forth. And I always ask the question, what's the net point? You know, when all the cars go this way, you know, if you counted all the cars going that way and all the cars going that way, what's the net movement? Why are we doing all this? It's kind of pointless. But in fact, this is what we're doing. Half the stuff's coming in here from China, and I don't know where our stuff's going, but that's the nature of modern life. And you can critique it, you can wish it wasn't there, you can do all sorts of things. But it's the nature of being very self-centered. It will then be confronted by the fact it lives in a single world and it has to find that relationship. And this, I think, is sort of boringly obvious, actually, but it helps you to see that, but on the one hand, we will become cosmopolitans as individuals, or at risk, if we don't, we will become little Englanders or very sort of fascist or very, you know, this is the downside of it. But in principle, we're trying to be part of one world family, and maybe in the future, there will only be one family. You know, we maybe won't even have surnames in the future. Again, it's a modern thing. You know, I worked for an American for quite a long time on his boat, as it happens. And after about 4 months, he said, "I'm going to give you an order." And I thought, what? No, I'm just working for you. Don't give me orders like this. He said, yes, I'm going to give you an order. Here's to call me Dick. Stop calling me Mr. Ross. And it was a huge problem for me. And he was very insistent. And time I left that boat, of course, he was American. As a little young English guy, I learned to call my adult boss by his first name. But it was such a big deal. You know, now, of course, with the internet and all this, who uses last names? Hardly anybody. So I think you can see that eventually we won't go by last names, but then how do we recognize one another? Where will our inheritance come from? Where will our, you know, how will you know that Christopher, what's my context without my surname? So I say these things because they're just all out there. They're so obvious. And so you can kind of, once you get that clear, you can see this economy is trying to become a world economy. The individuals are trying to become cosmopolitan. And the key to both is that in their national lives, they don't try either. But they say, okay, I'm English and I'm happy to be English, but I'm not going to foist that on anyone outside of England, nor do I want it foisted on me. It's not about my individuality or about my economic relations. It's just more my kind of folk story. And I think it's not complicated to see that the one big problem in history is what I call the grey time, is when the nation state could have separated. You can already see it in the Bank of England. In fact, the mother of all central banks, you could see in the way it was constituted, there was already the case that you had the sort of government, and then the Bank of England was just a group of people who said, well, we will manage the economic life in relationship with you. And then the king gave them a charter to do this. So you already see there's some kind of agreement between the government and those in the economy. You manage the economy in a way which is beneficial to everybody, obviously, and get on with it. And it's only later in its history that it's become, it and other central banks have become instruments of the state as opposed to partners with the state. And this I call the grey time because it's not clear that there is this relationship. It's very unknown in history by historians. It's not clear that it's there, but when you go into the grey area, you can start to see these little, and so how different it would have been if, say, in the case of the Bank of England, which is not an accidental example, it had carried on and become the kind of something that Churchill won't describe. It's the instance of an economic parliament. That was his image. And he was very clear in the 1930s, not only him, but if you look at the history of economic life, Churchill was saying we need already in the 1930s, when gold was becoming a big problem, we need to have a kind of political parliament which speaks to an economic parliament. And this idea is absent, but if you introduce it, it's not difficult to see. The problem you will then have is if you look at all the many institutions that represent economic life, chambers of commerce or all sorts of associations of industries and so on, the problem is they're not necessarily thinking of the world as a whole, they're furthering their own interests, understandably. And so people say, well, you can't entrust the economy to private people. And I'm saying, well, when you get your pay packet, what do? You know, so it's not necessarily true. You can't trust the economy to private people. It is necessarily true that if they only think of themselves, we'll have a problem. So we're back in the same situation. And I think all these things are so latent that just drawing attention to them, you just get a different sense of where we are and what's possible. But there need to be some structural things. And the main one would be, you can sense it anywhere. If you just ask every national economy to stop calling itself that, and for the state to not find its identity in being economically powerful, you know, or trying to be the culture that everyone's going to have. You know, there are many nations that want their culture to be, you know, I speak for my own, right? We're very clear the world will become English if it has any sense. It would make its life much easier if it just adopted Englishness, right? This is hidden behind central banking. It's easy to have an independent central bank in a cold climate. It's pretty much a no-brainer. But why should you impose zero inflation on a hot country? It doesn't make sense. And why do we go to hot countries when we need some respite from our cold offices? So I could tell I'm being fairly sort of I'm not being glib. I'm just trying to leave it in a kind of anecdotal level, because you can find all this language hidden inside economics. You can't expect zero inflation in a sunny climate, quote unquote. I'm not going to tell you who I'm quoting, but I'm quoting, right? Why? Is it, because when we go there for our vacations, we just hang out. You know, it's manana territory, you know, let's do it tomorrow. You know, we lead a Mediterranean life. So they don't get that bit. They don't get that they have a nice house in the south of France for their vacations, right? And they wouldn't want central bank independence to be messing up their villa life in Côte d'Azur or whatever. So I'm saying things because they're anecdotal, but they're true, and therefore a key question is, how does any nation or any state or any country get its identity other than by pushing itself on its culture and everybody else, and other than by being more economically powerful than the neighbor? This is the key question. And I think if you come into that, a very simple one for me, it's very easy here. If I look at the people driving up from Dover. So Dover is a town right nearby me, and I often go there to see ships and things like this. We have lovely liners come in there. And when I'm driving back, we have keep to the left in about 6 languages. Because for many people, for everybody, in fact, other than the English people coming home, everybody else has been keeping right their whole life long. And they get about 10 miles of instruction, keep left, in about 6 languages, right? That would be, I don't know, Swedish, Dutch, German, French, and whatever. And it's again, it's a picture, because here we drive on the left. We don't drive on the right. And there's no point insisting on driving on the right, because we drive, you just cause problems. You can do it on the right, but it'll be very difficult. And so I use this example quite often, because you just have to, when in Rome, I was going to say speak Roman, but you adopt the culture where you go. You don't bring yours with you. And you're no less an English person by speaking Italian, in my opinion, than insisting on English. So this sits in it's a huge cultural problem people have. And in the background, in fact, is two problems which you can't separate them. If your country status, if I'll stay with being English, if I need to find my identity being English, it can't be through cheap English products. And if I deny myself this, and I also deny myself, it can't be by speaking louder English when I'm in France, then I have actually an objective problem. So what am I grounding myself on? And you will then find it, but it's very ephemeral, because it won't be shared with anybody else. A cosmopolitan economy, we're all going to have oranges somewhere in the world, right? And in the world economy, it's a kind of counter picture, if you like. You go anywhere around the world, try and find an authentic souvenir, right, that hasn't in fact been made in China, isn't in fact in every single airport around the world. When I started traveling in the 60s, you never found anything the same. But now you can't. So in those 2 dimensions, it's very easily identifiable. But if you deny yourselves these identifiable things, then you come to this place which is almost not speakable. What is my national heritage, in fact, grounded on? And so for me, I'm aware of this whenever I give talks about this, because you can just see it in the room. And you have to kind of honor this situation, honor the fact you're creating a kind of problem for people by requiring them to ground their nationality on something ephemeral. And this, they have to find a way to do it. If you're saying the world economy is not national, but it's shared, you're going to have to do something with your psychology in order to share the wealth of the world, and not just go, actually, it's mine, and so on. So this may sound strange, but as I say, I'm not an economist. But if you have any sense of plot, these things are important.